Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you very much to everybody that has stuck with us throughout the day today. I have the task of trying to wrap up and trying to summarize everything that we've discussed here today. And I think the first thing that I just want to mention is that I think for many of us, having these types of discussions can be quite challenging, and I think many people will go home today feeling slightly battered and bruised based on the discussions that were had. But it's something that we at the Economic Association have always felt extremely strongly about, that we must talk about challenging issues in the country. And it's the same reason that people like myself and many others get themselves into a great deal of trouble, because we feel that it's important that we air our views and that we hear other people's views, and that we don't bury complex topics because they're complex. And as a result of that, we do try to talk about things that I think are often quite challenging. So in that regard, while I suspect some people will feel a bit battered and bruised, I hope that there's a general recognition of the benefits that come with that in terms of opening up discussions on some complex topics in the country. So I think, as we've heard today, economic inequality is a very complex issue. And because it's such a complex issue, taking it at its face value is perhaps not the most beneficial thing to do. And I think in many ways, while it is a very important indicator, it's an indicator that we have to look at in conjunction with large numbers of other indicators. Many countries in the world are less unequal than Namibia, or more equal than Namibia. However, people's lives are not necessarily better, and that's really what matters, is the state of people's lives and livelihoods. And so as a result of this, I think it's quite important that when we look at inequality, we do it through a broader prism, a broader lens than just this one specific indicator, usually in the form of a Gini coefficient. And I think that if you do that and you look at Namibia over time, what you find is that we have seen substantial changes. We see it actually in this Gini coefficient indicator. Namibia is not becoming a less equal society, despite some of the comments to the contrary. But at the same time, we do still sit with massive issues. So this slow improvement with regards to inequality in and of itself doesn't really tell us enough. Roughly half the population of the country lives without electricity. Roughly half the population of the country lives without access to a formal toilet. A third of the population of the country doesn't have running water into their yards. A third of the population lives in shacks. 1 in 3, 1 in 4 young children growing up in Namibia grows up without water or electricity in a shack. And this is something that we cannot just ignore and we cannot easily get away from. And to look at people that grow up under difficult circumstances against people that grow up in much easier circumstances and say, oh, well, you must just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and sort yourself out and compete on a level playing field is clearly not very helpful. And it's one of the reasons that we think it's important to host these types of discussions. What I find very heartening when it comes to a lot of these discussions, though, is that and despite perceptions to the contrary, and I think perceptions which are often created with ill intent, but despite these perceptions to the contrary, I think most Namibians care about each other and do actually want to try and help one another, whether they are young, old, white, black, male, female. I think most Namibians look at poverty, look at inequality, and do worry about it. The big challenge when it comes to this, and I get accused of saying things through an economic prism, it's something that I do because I am an economist. But the challenge with this is that if you look at the record of history when it comes to trying to address this issue of inequality, particularly if you do it at this symptom level, the record of history is quite clear. Almost without exception, in fact, I can't find an exception, but that's not to say one doesn't exist. When we try and redistribute at symptom level, we ultimately end up causing more problems than we solve. And this is particularly if done with a very, very blunt instrument type approach. This isn't me trying to paint my ideology on somebody else. This is just an observation of what I've seen through the economic literature and through the economic data. Nevertheless, I think, and particularly in light of this, I think that it's important that we don't fall for the belief that I think is often shared on social media and similar, that our utopia for Namibians and for ourselves is but one small redistributive change away. The record of history, as I say, is clear. And in Namibia, were we to distribute everything that we had, it would result in just over $3,000 per person per month in terms of income. And I think just as important as it is to recognize this, I think that it's also very important to recognize that the current distribution of income, current distribution of assets in the country is far from just. Much wealth in the country, both before and after independence, has been collected in manners and accumulated by individuals in manners that are far from fair, far from just. And I think that this is something that we cannot ignore as a country, and we should not ignore as a country. But in this regard, I think that what we do need to do is we need to create an environment in the country that ensures that we do not sit with this continuation of a rigged game, where some people have far greater opportunities than others. And I think that this is an argument that can be made by either left or right orientated people, that ultimately this inequality is not a good thing for the country, and it's something that we do have to address, particularly when it comes to opportunities. And I think today we've heard a lot about what can be done, and I'm sure there is disagreement as to some of the points as to what can be done, but that doesn't, in my mind, constitute any sort of issue. I think it's great if we have disagreements and we challenge each other in order to try and further our thinking and to better understand different positions. So first and foremost, I think I'm going to come back to the issue that gets me into trouble, and that is that of property rights. Property rights, I think, is something that's poorly understood, and I think it's often confused with ownership of a specific asset. Protecting property rights is basically saying that if you own something, and particularly if you acquired it in a legitimate manner, that you should be able to enjoy the benefits that derive from that entity. And you should also be able to decide whether you want to use it or not. But the proviso is that those assets were acquired in a legitimate manner, and we know that there are challenges around that in the country. So we mustn't confuse property rights with the ownership of specific assets. Deciding that we're going to throw out property rights because a few people own something that we believe that they shouldn't own is a terrible response to a critical issue. I think I'll leave the property rights debate there. You can find more of it on Twitter, there's plenty. When it comes to my second issue that I think has been discussed extensively today is that issue of education. The side of the railroad tracks on which you're born, whether you're born in an urban area or a rural area, should not determine your future. And unfortunately in Namibia, to a great extent, it still does. And this is not fair, it is not just. In this regard, I think that the reason that we end up with so many of the issues that we end up is because productive capital, as was discussed earlier today, takes many different forms. But the one thing that we all have is our labor. And our ability to utilize that labor to generate positive benefits for ourselves should not be diminished in terms of its value or disregarded in terms of its value. The fact that some children in this country go to literally some of the best schools in the world, and others go to highly under-resourced schools, these same children often have to spend a lot of time collecting wood, collecting water, and similar for their households, is a major issue that perpetuates inequality through time. And it's one of the reasons that we are struggling to get on top of this issue of a lack of equality of outcome because of this incredible lack of equality of opportunity in the country. When it comes to the solutions to education, I think they're a great deal. Personally, I am in favor of a partial privatization of certain educational institutions whereby parents pay some small contribution to the school and the state continues to collect tax and make some small contributions to the school as well, thereby increasing the accountability between the parents and the administration of the school. I think this is one of the potential solutions. In Namibia, we spend roughly $20,000 a year educating children that go through the public education system. This is a lot of money by global standards. It's roughly double the global average, and yet the outcomes that we experience are roughly half the global average. This gives us an impression that our productivity in terms of this specific issue is about a quarter, or efficiency is about a quarter of the global average. And this is a serious issue. Money is not the problem when it comes to education. There clearly are other factors, and there's been extensive research done around the world on what those can be. The third major issue that I think we have discussed, but obviously it's an issue that requires a great deal more discussion, is the issue of land and land tenure. Land, and particularly commercial land in Namibia, is a hugely emotive issue, largely because there is a strong and I think very rationally founded view that land ownership in the country is unjust. This is undeniably because of the country's history, and certainly many of the developments since independence haven't helped very much either. This is a point we can't ignore, and we would be very unwise to ignore it. The fact that we do have these imbalances around the ownership of land in the country are likely to cause instability if not addressed. Plus, I think all of us agree that justice is required where an injustice took place in the past or in the present. That said, I don't believe that land is the panacea to our issues of poverty and our issues of inequality, particularly when it comes to commercial land. I say this once again, not because I own land myself, but mainly because of the fact that I've done a little bit of research into it. And what I find is that the net value added in agriculture in Namibia tends to be negative. And so the old joke about how to make a small fortune out of farming is never more relevant than it is in Namibia. And that joke goes, how do you make a small fortune out of farming? Well, you start with a large fortune. So farming is not necessarily going to be the solution, but that doesn't in any way mean that the distribution of land at the moment is fair or that it should remain the way it is. But we do need to go through a sensible process when we address that specific issue. While I don't believe that commercial farmland is likely to be the panacea to our problems, I have a very different view when it comes to both communal land and land tenure in communal areas, and when it comes to urban land in the country. And I think these points have been brought up a number of times through the day. When it comes to housing, it's hard, and particularly housing in urban areas, it's hard to stress sufficiently the benefits of taking children out of impoverished households made of tin and zinc, without access to running water, without access to electricity, and without access to good sanitation, and getting those children into houses where they can study at night thanks to electricity. They are much safer than they are in informal settlements. They have running water, so they don't have to spend a lot of time collecting water. They have electricity to cook on, so they don't have to spend a lot of time collecting firewood on which to cook. And of course that they have better sanitation. These benefits are enormous and will go a huge amount of the distance to addressing many of the challenges that we face around equalizing, at least to some degree, opportunities in the country. Land tenure is not in the communal areas is not something I'm going to go into. I think John is far more experienced in that regard, as are many other people than I am. The fifth point that Nangula spoke about, and Nangula is always one of my favorites to listen to. She says sensible things and she's incredibly likable while she does it. So that makes for a great talk generally. And I think that the key points that she made around allocation of resources and the fact that Namibia is actually a relatively well-endowed country when it comes to resources. If we look at the government specifically, our government has between the second and the fifth highest tax to GDP ratio, tax revenue to GDP ratio in the world. It varies year to year, but between the second and the fifth highest in the world. And what this means is that we have plenty of resources in the public pot to address many of the challenges that we face in the country. However, misprioritization, mismanagement, and corruption constantly eat away at this. In this regard, I ask a simple question. How can we possibly be prioritizing the likes of large new Home Affairs head offices with marble floors? How can we be prioritizing the bailout of failing and corrupt state-owned enterprises? And how can we be prioritizing nice-to-have infrastructure over houses for our country's children? Another factor that I think is very important when it comes to addressing this issue is one which often comes across in the wrong way. That is the issue of hard work. If you work hard and you have a fair chance at life, you should be able to become relatively wealthy relatively prosperous, and you should not feel bad for it. If you do so by holding somebody else back, if you do so at somebody else's expense, the situation is obviously different. But given relatively equal opportunity, hard work should be something that we reward in the country. That said, the playing field does need to be level when it comes to this. It is unfair for one child with great opportunity to become wealthy and then to look down on others with less opportunity and say, oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The seventh issue that I've got, and I think came up once or twice during the day, is the issue of growth. As I mentioned, if we redistribute what we currently have, we sit with about just over $3,000 per person per month in the country. That's assuming that nobody finds a clever way to take some of their wealth that's greater than that, or their income that's greater than that, and leaves the country. So we need more money in the country. We need to grow the economy. We need to create jobs. We need to create wealth. And in order to do this, we need investment. And how do we get investment? Well, we get investment by creating investor-friendly policy that attracts people to invest in the country so that they can generate wealth, can generate opportunities, and can generate jobs in the country. This is a challenging argument to make because I think many people view it as saying we must treat those that already have a lot as special vis-a-vis those who currently don't have very much. And I don't make that argument. The argument that I make is that we need to provide more equal opportunity, but at the same time, we need to try and encourage job creation in the country and to attract job creators to the country and, of course, incentivize Namibians to become job creators for each other as well. It's my belief that Namibia sits with a huge opportunity. We do have major issues. We have the legacies of apartheid, we have the legacy of colonialism, we have our current levels of debt, we have stagnation in the economy. And I believe that these are all issues that we do need to address and we do need to seek redress for as and where we possibly can. However, this also presents us with a huge opportunity because these are challenges that much of the region faces. And Africa has the potential to be the fastest growing continent in the world. The country on the continent that takes advantage of these challenges in that they address these challenges in a pragmatic, clear manner that shows that the country is not turning a blind eye to its history, not turning a blind eye to its issues, but addressing these challenges in a way that will ensure that the country can become more wealthy, that investors can come to the country safely, and that there's predictability around their property rights, around their investment and similar, puts you in a brilliant position when it comes to being the center for investment into Africa from much of the rest of the world. And I believe that this is an opportunity that Namibia has that will help our Namibian people become better off in the future. The ninth point that I want to make, and it's the second last one, is the point on innovation. And this was brought up once or twice through the day today. As has been mentioned, there is a price to pay in innovation, and this price is inequality. However, this is the type of innovation that brings about the prospects of wealth, of jobs, and of improvement in Namibian lives. And how many of us have not applauded the likes of Ashilongo Leather or similar for their ideas, for their efforts, and for the wealth and growth and jobs that they've created in the country? This should be encouraged. But this inequality that it creates is, unfortunately, in my view, a necessary evil. That said, we cannot allow a situation where this game is rigged in favor of a few at the expense of the many. We need to level the playing field, and to do this, we need to ensure that we do not sow the seeds of future inequality at the current point in time. My last point is perhaps my own. Inequality causes instability. And I think enough inequality will cause a great deal of instability in Namibia if we don't go about addressing it. So yes, rich people should be worried about this as much as poor people should. Inequality is a Namibian issue. It's not an issue for the poor, but it's an issue for the country. And I think that we need to take it seriously and try and address it as best we can. Thank you.